Good morning, everybody. Thanks for hopping on today and joining us for our next webinar on Enterprise Insights. Today, we're going to be talking to you about family enterprise transitions and successions and different things you should contemplate when you're going through that. I am joined today by my colleague, Shondell Sabad, who it is his birthday today. So happy birthday, Shondell, and thank you for celebrating your birthday on this fabulous webinar.
Couldn't think of a better way to celebrate my birthday, Krista. Thank you.
Throughout the webinar, there's going to be a couple of things. So we will have polling questions throughout the webinar, and it is required for you to complete all 3 polling questions in order to receive the CPE. They're going to be popping up throughout various times in the webinar, and you'll have approximately 30 seconds to a minute to answer those questions. We also do encourage everybody to please ask questions throughout the webinar. You'll see on your screen the Q&A function. Sean and I will be monitoring that throughout our discussion. Some of them we may leave till the end, depending on the question is, and some of them we might answer throughout the webinar if time permits. Usually we will leave about 10 minutes at the end for questions if there are any. Once the webinar ends, you will receive a link to a survey. We please do ask that you complete that survey. We take all of the feedback to heart on different subjects people want to hear about, or feedback on any type of technical stuff that you have comments on, as well as you have the ability to ask questions throughout that process as well. And finally, if you would like, there is the live transcript, available. Please just click that if you would like a transcript as we're going. So today we're talking about why governance matters, and how to use some best practices throughout your succession planning. You know, we're coming into an era of massive transition. It's already started. And I think it's important that people, and especially for the advisors on the call, to really understand why it's important to have multiple layers prior to succession. You know, sometimes it is, as advisors, we can get caught up in the, ooh, they want to do an estate plan, or they want to do a rollover, etc. And we forget to ask some really important questions prior to executing those. And, you know, I've been around long enough that I know how many times those structures fail once they start to execute, because you didn't really dig deep into the roots. So part of the conversation we're talking about today is, what is the soft stuff that matters? Not the tax plan, not the legal plan, not the wealth plan, but what is the stuff that truly is ingrained in a family enterprise that can affect those plans should they be put in place? So, you know, what is the reality of family succession enterprise? Only 30% of family businesses actually make it to the next generation. And a lot of time people, as I said, they go, well, you know what, I'm ready to give my business to my child. Help us do this tax-wise, legal-wise. And there's a lot more that goes into it that needs to be planned in advance of that takeover. And I think a lot of times there's an inherent, you know, the child worked in the business forever, so they know the business. However, there's one thing to be an owner of a business versus an operator of a business. And there's a lot of things, and we'll talk about it throughout our discussion, that come into play when you're dealing with those things, because if the succession planning is not done properly, I mean, yes, we all have the tax and legal background. That might not work if it's not executed accordingly. However, if the other dynamics of the family are not dealt with, or the leadership training, that is where the businesses generally stem to fail. And it doesn't succeed, or the founders have to come back into the business because there wasn't kind of that thorough development and transition of leadership into being an owner and what that might be. And I think there's a lot of stuff that happens where, you know, a founder may delay making that decision. There's people, you know, there who think this is a quick process. Once you implement the plan, you just do it. This type of stuff actually takes years of conversations, years of planning, years of discussions, and getting it in place so that you have that improved plan and estate plan so that it's fully understanding, who's making decisions, who's involved in what, who do we need at different tables, and ensuring that that is in place. So why does governance actually matter? Inherently, family enterprises, the business. So there's three circles that generally exist within the family enterprise, and we talk about that a lot at Family Enterprise Canada. You have the family circle, you have the business circle, and you have the ownership circle. And then you kind of have that intermingling of all of those circles that exist within a family enterprise. And as much as you try to avoid emotional decisions when dealing with a family enterprise, they exist. And we all have it with our families, and it could even just be, where are we taking a family vacation? And then somehow that spills into the business because there's no kind of thoughtful governance around where conversations belong. The family conversations, the business conversations, and the ownership conversations, and how each of those different conversations might affect one another. And when you create a specific governance around each of those modules within a family enterprise, that's where you can start to have accountability and hold each other to a certain standard of, if you're sitting around, let's say you're sitting at a Christmas dinner, and all of a sudden you start talking about a sale with a customer. It's like, wait, that's a business, not a family. We're in family right now. So it's truly creating that governance around a family enterprise as to how are decisions made within, and what conversations belong in a business, how are decisions made in the family and what conversations belong in a family, and ownership. How are decisions about ownership made, and who's involved and what conversations are surrounding that. And really, at the end of the day, that is going to help protect the enterprise value. And the enterprise value isn't just the business, right? The enterprise value is the family enterprise. It's the family cottage. It's the business. It's the retirement. It's the unknown factors. Maybe there's heirlooms. Like, a family enterprise contains a lot of dynamics that come into the conversation and really need to be discussed, and figuring out the governance around how all of that is happening. And like I said earlier, a lot of time as advisors, we come in and we say, okay, we can do an estate plan for you because we have the technical wherewithal to do said estate plan. Very rarely are we digging deeper to find the different things that we're going to talk about today to help execute that estate plan, so that when it ever comes to pass, the fights have already been had versus trying to fight in the past. Also, I mean, inherently there's going to be crisis. As everybody knows right now, there's tons of crises going on. The world is full of chaos. Chaos and crisis creates instability. Whenever you have formal governance, you're better able to deal with that instability and chaos and crisis, because you've created a foundation. And, if you build a house, you think about building a house, you're going to build a very strong foundation so that you can then build the tower, or the tower will collapse. And so it's a similar type of thought process when you're looking into family governance, creating that strong base, that strong foundation of ensuring that you understand what conversations are where, who's making decisions, how are decisions made, etc. So that you can then move into the tower building. So what are some common family governance structures that exist? Well, I mean, there's both internal governance structures as well as external structures. And here are some of the structures that generally exist within a family enterprise. Now, there's many. So, I think these are just a snippet of some of the different governance structures that might exist when you're dealing with a family enterprise. Then you have the family council, where you have the family members who are appointed to have conversations. And especially as you're kind of moving into third, fourth, fifth generation, this is really going to matter, because it's going to be very hard for everybody to have a solid voice at the table on every decision. And so you're going to be creating this council around who's having those conversations. Maybe you choose to have a board of directors. And, you know, sometimes I hear enterprises say, well, I can't afford a board of directors. That's just too expensive. And I often push back to them saying, can you afford not to have a board of directors? Or do you actually already have one? You just haven't formalized it. And what I mean by that is you have the family, and this is more around the business. So you have the family who are decision makers. They're part of the board of directors. You say you have your accountants, you have your lawyers, you have your financial planners. They're all giving advice. So maybe they're part of the board of directors. Maybe you have a friend who you talk business with constantly and going to them for advice. They are part of a board of directors. So you may actually already informally have what would look like a board of directors. However, where the problem happens is if those board of directors are all meeting with each other one-on-one, you don't create that coherent conversation and getting one fulsome advice. And so when you have a formal board of directors and getting people together in a room, having conversations all together, that can really actually help to solidify some of the decision making and governance. And you know, it's important to have those conversations together and advisors working together to support the family enterprise. Advisory committee, again, those are your external people for different platforms. A shareholder agreement, a family charter, those are things to, you know, if conflict happens, you know, you can go to your family charter or you can go to your shareholder agreement, as well as a conflict resolution. So there's lots of different kind of scenarios in which all of these different governance structures can come into play. And as I said, there's probably many more that it can exist within a family enterprise. However, these are some of the things that, you know, I would say are first and foremost when you're starting to undergo a succession of a business to a next generation. And you know, especially when you have multiple aspects to your enterprise that you're trying to decide how it's going to be split out. And I've said this many times, and I've Dr. Thomas Dean actually is where I heard it, where he says silence is the destroyer of wealth. If we do not talk about it, we are guaranteed to destroy part of our wealth. And so what all of this about is having those conversations in advance together and working through some of the conflict that might exist within a family enterprise to have a successful transition. And again, it is not going to take 3 months. This is going to take a minimum of probably 3 years because there's a lot of moving dynamics that exist within a family enterprise. Shondell, do you have anything else to add on this?
No, I think you bring up a good point. A lot of what you need to do is, I won't call it simple, but the concepts might seem relatively simplistic, but the execution is it's extraordinarily hard.
Yeah.
So that's where sometimes you might want to lean on outside resources or additional training. You know, you touched on communication. I'll talk about it almost on every slide. And we can't emphasize enough how important communication is.
Yeah, you know, and we talked about in one of the previous slides about how the emotion gets involved. And I think a lot of enterprises also say, well, we can just handle this. We can talk about this. It's very difficult when you are the person in the emotional conflict to be able to break away from that emotional conflict and not be in a reactionary state. And that's where kind of the third party people come in, whether it's a family enterprise advisor or a therapist or whatever, depending on what the conflict is. It's really going to inherently, you know, help mediate, help calm the conversation, help direct the conversation, because that emotional quotient is always going to exist. It is always going to exist, no matter how much we can say, oh, I'm thinking about this logically. If there is a personal threat to you in any way, big or small, it is very difficult for us to, as humans to silence that emotional quotient within us. So we'll head to our first polling question here. What governance structure will help an enterprise be most successful in a transition? I think, Shondell, it's funny when you think about this and some of the enterprises that I've had the pleasure of working with throughout, the business transition coaching I do. It's always inherently very difficult to segregate family from business. And that's where I think I know we're going to talk about this where a third
Mhm.
party matters, right? It's a very difficult thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And you'll see board of directors on there. That's actually, in my experience, been the most common one. But having said that, if you don't separate those three boxes, the board of directors is fantastic. But if you haven't gotten along with your brother or your sister or your father, it's pretty hard for the board of directors to do its job.
That's right.
So yeah, that
Yeah,
that communication and that conflict resolution really matters. And some of
that's
these
right.
other avenues, whether it's a family council or a charter, can help at least have a process around that conflict resolution.
Yeah, exactly. Hence
Mhm.
why, as most people said, all of the above are actually
Mhm.
very important to help a successful transition. And I often hear from people, well, that's just going to cost so much money. And I always push back to people and say, some of this you're already doing. You just haven't
Mhm.
formalized it. So you actually need to formalize it and create that room and that structure around the governance. Um, but then I also say, can you afford not to do this? Because if you don't do this, the result can be the business failing, right? And that's going to be even more expensive. So there's a lot of nuances that go into this. And maybe I'll let you move on to the successor readiness and how that plays into this.
Yeah, thanks, Krista. Yeah, you bring up a lot of good points, and hopefully I'm able to touch on some of them as we move through these next slides, because like you said, not doing something like this is not an option. Whether it's a transition or a business sale, buyers expect it. They expect good governance. And I think what it really does is it sets a process in place that shows management, family, outsiders, customers that you're taking this type of thing seriously. So hopefully we'll touch on some of these. So let's start with successor readiness versus the family expectations. I think, in a lot of cases that we've seen, the expectation of the family or the original business leader is that this individual is ready for leadership and will take over the business. So what you really got to be careful of is, do they really want to do this? Family successors, first of all, have to have the interest level. And you really do have to dig a bit, you do have to dig deep on this, because having the outside interest without the skills or the experience can lead to failure. We also, we want to be cognizant about the tensions between current management and successors. So we want to be addressing things like the perception that, is this person getting this position because of family ties, or are they really the right person for this role? And then also there is that I think conflict between the generations. Next gen leaders, they often want innovation and new ideas, while the older generations who are potentially exiting, they might prioritize stability, cash flows, and those types of things. So when preparing successors, we want to make sure that what we're doing is that we have structured leadership development. And again, most people on this call know what that looks like. And again, relatively simple process, but execution is key. And this is especially important, more so in family enterprises than it is in private enterprises, because private cos or pub cos, they tend to have a formalized process with a lot of input with respect to who's going to be backfilling for certain positions. And what you want to do is, when you're in a family enterprise, look at things like external education, mentorship, and also, like you said earlier, gradual involvement in decision making and taking over new roles. This, this isn't, the first generation deciding, hey, I think I'm going to retire in a year. Son number one, why don't you take over the business? This has to happen over a period of many, many years. And
Mhm.
like you mentioned, research shows that 30% of family businesses only survive into the second generation. That's actually, you know, a quite sobering statistic. And a lot of that is often because the successors weren't properly prepared. Working in a business is a lot different than actually taking the reins and running it. So you want to make sure that that new generation is prepared in every way to be able to do that. And you want to make sure you're managing that expectation that where the family assumes that that next generation wants to lead and can lead. Um,
Mhm.
and if not, try and identify the gaps so that you're setting up that next generation for success. So
Yeah,
identifying,
oh,
yeah, go
go ahead.
ahead. No, go ahead.
No, I was going to say it's interesting you say that because if you think about a family that has, say, three children, and two want in or one wants in, one doesn't, two, et cetera, et cetera. And I often hear, and over the years that I've been practicing, the amount of post-mortem lawsuits
Mhm.
that exist because oh well, why did my brother get shares? He never worked in the business and he didn't help build this business, so why would he get shares in this business when I did all the work? And there's fights
Mhm.
over that. And or it's the why, because my brother in the business, he gets the entire estate. Why is that fair? I was a kid too. So there's so many components going into family expectations on this transition. And the first line that you have there about lack of interest, skills, or experience is individualistic, right? Like
Yes.
it's per person. And that conversation, we'll talk about the different things, but
Mhm.
we talk about the group conversation, but those individual conversations with the advisors are just as important.
Well, and probably more important because you do see instances where, one or two of the second generation or third generation may be working in the business and the
Yeah,
rest aren't, but they're
yeah,
shareholders. So, there can be tremendous pressure to look for a liquidity event. And then all of a sudden, that generation that is active in the business could potentially be out of work. And
that's right.
these are all the types of things that, unless you're talking about it as a family or a group, you know, like you said, end up in court.
Yeah,
And
yeah. And then that's the destroyer of wealth, right?
that's the
Now you're
destroyer of
paying
wealth. Yeah.
more accountant and legal fees and advisor fees post-mortem because you're trying to clean up. And I always tell people it's way more expensive to clean up than it is to do it right the first time. Way more
That,
expensive. Yeah,
that's right.
yeah,
So if we focus on a couple of action items, that people on the call can think about, because again, the concepts aren't, you know, I won't say they're not complicated because they are. It's the execution, because applying these concepts within each individual business requires nuances, right? Sometimes something might be more important in this instance than in this instance. But in general, overlying all of this is you want to start with structured leadership pathways. So that could include things like job rotations. You always hear, about someone who started a business, let's say as an electrician or whatever, said, oh, I used to drive around in the truck with my dad. So, that person got exposure to all areas of the business. So job rotations are very, very important. External roles might help. Okay, individual A, we believe, or we've discussed that you will eventually take over this business. Maybe go work for someone outside this industry so that you could develop your leadership and your way of doing business. So I think what you want to do when you're looking at a structured leadership pathway is you want to align the interests and the skill. Where are the skills lacking? And do the most important skills in running a business align with the interest level of the individual who you believe may be the one to succeed you? So very, very important, those distinctions. And you also want to include outside experience. So successors who, I think for successors who have worked outside the family business, they almost always return stronger they have more credibility within the organization, they have more skills, and they have a different perspective, I think, which is very important. And then, of course, mentorship and external advisors. Could be FEA, could be coaches, could be industry mentors, are essential to supplement that knowledge and objectivity. Um, and then gradual involvement in governance. Obviously operations are probably where most successors will focus their attention, but then that gradual involvement in things like as a board observer, advisory committees, maybe some of the board committees, I think it allows that next gen to be able to ease into it, learn without being thrown into a specific function. So again, I have talked about on the chat, or pardon me, the questions. Krista and I wrote a series of blogs on family enterprises, and in blog number 2, we actually talk about succession planning. So we go into that in a little bit more detail, obviously talking about some of the pitfalls which we've mentioned here today, but also the importance of pre-planning and mentorship. And then we also talk about the role of external advisors in our first blog, where we highlighted the value that advisors bring, and most importantly, the objectivity they bring when you talk about things like succession planning. So if we can slide to the next slide, we'll talk about some of the best practices. So what's that framework for succession? You want to be able to identify successors. And what that means is a group decision. You want an objective approach, which isn't the 2 people involved, but it may include input from hiring committee, or it could even include external experts, either whether advisors or subject matter experts. And then you want to prepare through mentorship, governance exposure, external training. And then you want that transition to have clear timelines, as well as identification of the skills gap and how those skills gaps are going to be filled in. And then, as always, you'll hear me talk about it on every slide: communicate, communicate, communicate. So why does all this stuff matter? Well, like you said earlier, Krista, without a structured process, succession is doomed to failure. Because if left to assumptions, which tends to happen, it just leads to misaligned interest, conflict, uncertainty, and a slow, steady decline. So what you want to be doing in this process is you want to go beyond the family ties. You want to evaluate successors on capability, fit, but also that desire and the ability to lead. And this early identification allows, with external advisors or skill gap training, allows you to identify any of those missing gaps. And again, the whole goal in this is to set that next gen up for success. And then you want preparation. You need a mix of internal exposure, whether the new leadership is going to sit on family councils, board meetings, and you want that external experience. So perhaps industry roles, external training. This all helps to build the skills and credibility for that next gen leader. And then again, we talked briefly about defining the timeline and setting clear milestones. So those milestones may be role-based, could be skills-based, but you want that phased responsibility. And what you also want to be doing is building contingency plans in case that individual decides they don't want to do this. So,
It's
go ahead.
interesting you talk about this with the sense of you were talking about leadership, and sometimes it's actually not next gen that's going to be the next CEO. Sometimes it might just actually, and it might be good for the business that you hire a third party CEO to come in and have next gen learn from them as well, depending on the readiness, depending on the fit and all of that and the skills, right?
Yeah.
There's so many different ways that that this can play out. And as we talked about in the beginning, having those upfront conversations to communicate, as Shondell said, having those upfront conversations to understand. One of the things I often hear is, oh, they're just not ready. I mean, the child might be 50 years old, and no matter what, the parent will always say to me, and every parent has said it to me, oh, they're not ready. because they haven't defined what is ready. What
Yeah.
are the skills that are needed? What are you looking for? And it's a subjective approach, and there's no real role definition as to what does ready mean. And that's what a lot of these best practices are, is creating that. What is ready? What does that
Hmm.
mean?
Well, you actually, I was just about to make that very point. So it's very, very important. In a lot of instances, it could include interim leadership, external
Mm-hmm.
leadership, or internal leadership. Because what the goal is not just to have the successor ready, but have them accepted by the business. And sometimes the best avenue might be to bring in an interim leader, even just for a year or two, to manage that transition to that next phase. So I think you always want to have that option on the table, because the second thing is, if your successor ends up going through all that work and decides, man, I really just want to sit in the lab and make stuff, you want to have that plan that says, oh, they're not going to do this. Who have we identified that could come in and fill that role of interim CEO or CFO or whatever that role might be? So that's a great point, Chris. Very, very
Mm-hmm.
important to consider. And
So
then,
how about the role? Are you going to role advisors? Sorry.
no, no,
Oh, not yet. Okay.
I was just going to
Sorry.
mention that, again, on two of our blogs, we talk a lot about this. I won't mention communication anymore, because it really is key to each one of these points. But we talk about succession planning in blog number 2. We cover things like survival rates, the importance of the structured plan, and preparing successors through education, mentorship, and also time. So ready to go to the next one, role of advisors.
All right.
So let's talk a little bit, and again, this really is a best practice, is whether you decide to have an advisor or not is a conversation that you need to have. But for many of you out there who have used them, you can probably attest to their value. And it doesn't have to be a formalized engagement with a trained advisor like a lawyer or an accountant or an FEA. It could be a family friend. But what you really want is someone who is going to understand the dynamics and the challenges that next leader is going to face. So the role of an advisor in whatever form, it can't be emphasized enough. So what value do they bring? In my personal opinion, the objectivity is the number one skill that they bring. And it just helps reduce that emotional bias. And what it does is it turns the table and allows that facilitation in a non-confrontational manner. So, and especially if you talk about facilitating through tough conversations and conflict resolution, which every business has it, every family has it. So when you combine those two things together, it can really be a powder keg. So to have that independent third party who can really just decrease the temperature of what is going to become a heated conversation just helps so much. So why does this matter? Again, family businesses are uniquely prone to emotional decision making. Krista, you mentioned that, I think, in the first slide. So these external advisors, they just help neutralize and bring a fact-based lens, because often when you do speak from that emotional framework, the facts might get distorted. So it just allows bring down that temperature. Let's look at this thing objectively, and it just helps a lot. So facilitating those conversations, helping families to address difficult issues without escalating conflict, and just having that process in place to say, hey, look, how should we be doing this? How should we have difficult conversations? How should we talk to our other children who either didn't get selected or didn't get this? Or how do we talk to this child who's all of a sudden going to have way more responsibility than his siblings might have or her siblings might have? So the most effective advisors, I think, are connectors, not just for the family themselves, but also for other external service providers, whether it's lawyers, accountants, governance professionals, and also family members. just act as that quarterback to bring people together, get them working and rolling in the same direction. Value add. I think advisors don't replace family decision making, they strengthen it by introducing best practices and also drawing insights from other family businesses and industry, all at the same time while maintaining that objectivity and accountability. So again, Krista mentioned this early, bring advisors in early, whether it's your Uncle Joe who knows a lot about the business and or an FEA advisor who's specifically trained in working with family offices. It just helps, it just helps save money down the road. It helps reduce stress and we'll probably end up saving relationships. And again,
Yeah.
we talked about this in our blog number 1, role of external advisors. Krista, anything else you want to add there?
Yeah, I was going to say, because there's a number of advisors are on the call as well. So I'm
Mhm.
just going to kind of speak to them as well. I think, we as advisors are trusted advisors. And when I took my family enterprise advisor designation as an accountant, I mean, my background is an accountant and a coach. So I kind of, when I was always working with clients, my brain always went, why are we just trying to solve a problem and not ask questions? Right? And I think to my fellow advisors, I talk about this a lot, but we need to be in the rooms together and collaborating for the better good of our client and understanding how, the dynamics of a family enterprise advisor works in the sense of it's not just about solving a problem. It's not just about creating the legal documents. It's not just about creating a tax estate plan. It's not like there's so many more depths to it. And I think in a way, sometimes we can do our clients a disservice when we stay at that surface level. Right. And I
Mhm.
think if I do any shout out to the advisors that are on this webinar, make sure you're engaging in those deeper conversations. And if you don't know what those deeper conversations should be, educating yourself as to what they mean, because we are planning for the livelihood of the future generations.
Mhm.
And if we're not kind of intermingling all of those other components into the estate plan or the sale purchase agreements, etc., I do believe we're doing somewhat of a disservice because we're missing the point, right? And
Mhm.
because we don't actually know what the point is. All we know is they're
Yeah.
like, okay, we're ready to do an estate plan, and we're really good at those, and no doubt that we're very good at those at what we do. It's what are all of those other components? And when I took my family enterprise advisor designation, that was almost eye-opening to me, going, oh, I never thought to ask that question. I never thought to
Mhm.
think of it that way. I mean, I'm not going to become a therapist, and we all have our strengths within the platform as advisors, but it's ensuring that we're collaborating with our fellow advisors and working together and not being afraid to work together for the better good of our clients. So that's just my side note to the advisors that are on call. Make sure
Mhm.
you're constantly thinking about that, right? Because it's easy to sell an estate plan.
Mhm.
It's not as easy to make sure it's an established estate plan that everybody agrees to, right?
Yeah.
And
It's a,
and and it's going to take a lot longer than 6 months of
mhm.
documentation.
It's that old adage, on the surface, everything's easy, but once you
Yeah,
dig deep, everything's hard.
that's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Don't be afraid to open the can of worms.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So just to tie this one off, I think, it's important for everybody, whether you're an advisor or a leader, is to ask yourself the question, is the successor ready? And do they want this? And if not, how can you prepare them? And you want to make sure you're setting them up for success. So on that note, let's go to the next slide, which is our polling question. This one just asks, it's true and false question. There's a 50% success rate of transitioning enterprises from one generation to the next. True or false? So again, just to highlight, because we did mention that in a lot of cases, the reason for failure in that next generation, um, isn't capability. It's usually planning, communication, and governance. So without these things, these processes in place, transition can become even more chaotic. That's why these frameworks, external advisors, and clear communication are so critical to help improve the odds of success. So, just when you're answering the question, just maybe think about some of those things.
Yeah, a lot of nuances, right?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of nuances. It is the can of worms or the barrel of monkeys or whatever you want to call it. You never know what you're going to get once you start digging in and asking questions and listening.
Alrighty, so
Pretty.
it looks like, yeah, pretty even, but 65% said that this is false. And indeed that is the case. This is a good mythbuster question because I remember before I knew the answer, I just believed it was higher. Most people believe that the success rate is at least 50% or higher, but the reality is much lower. Krista, you mentioned earlier that about 30% of family businesses don't survive into the second generation. And as you drop into the third generation, that number drops below 15%. So these tools that we're talking about today, again, they won't guarantee success, but they'll drastically increase the likelihood. So
Mm-hmm.
let's go on to the next slide, the emotional and operational challenges.
Yep.
So again, we talked about some practical terms, some practical things that we can do, some things that we need to look out for when we are transitioning. But now, and I know a lot of what Krista's work is in her family enterprise practice is dealing with these emotional challenges and the operational challenges. So as we know, family ties, unlike a private business, that those family ties just intensify the stress.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the other thing that you'll see within a family enterprise is resistance from long tenured, employees or leaders who might be reluctant. They perhaps have worked for the same individual for a long period of time and just have some reticence about that next generation. So that's certainly an emotional challenge. And then, of course, just the conflicts between one generation to the next. Tradition, stability versus innovation and more risk taking. And you mentioned this earlier, Krista, those blurred lines between family and business. Keeping in those three boxes and knowing which hat you're wearing is super important almost constantly. So not only does succession create family issues and business issues, the operational disruption can be massive. Again, unlike corporate environments, family relationships add that additional emotional weight. Sometimes disagreements become public within the business, and it can quickly, spill over into personal conflicts or even conflicts with current leadership. And what that's going to do is just destabilize the environment, destabilize the business, and make success even harder. We talked about this before. Long tenured founders, they often struggle to let go from one generation to the next. So it's, and Krista, you've probably seen this. I want my son or daughter to take over, but I want them to do it the way I want them to do it. So you become a leader, but not really a leader. So the reluctance that reluctance delays transition and obviously can frustrate that next generation. So again, what we want to talk about here is just making sure that those things are taken care of. And as you mentioned before, Krista, being inside those three boxes helps a lot. Having strong governance helps a lot because what you want to do is make sure that that operational stability is there. If it isn't, if succession is unclear or there's conflict, the employees see this and they're going to lose confidence. Customers are going to worry about continuity. And if competitors start seeing this, they're going to exploit the opportunity. So that's why this what we're talking about here today is so important. So maybe just a tip, treat emotional and operational challenges as two sides of the same coin. You need governance structures, communication, and bridge building for both of them. emotional and operational challenges. And you need it so that you can manage both effectively. And again, I think in our 6th blog, we talked about managing that resistance to change. So if you're interested, hop onto the website. I think we have 7 or 8 blogs on family enterprises. And these are some of the things that we talk about. Krista, anything to add there? Because I know this is a big part of what you do.
No, I think we've talked about everything already. We can hop to the
Next one.
complexities. Yeah.
Yeah, so this one, Krista again mentioned it earlier in the presentation. Transition is complex and more complex in a family enterprise, I think, than it is in a public enterprise, simply because there's a more structured process around it. And there tends to be a lot less, emotional decision making being made. So what happens if you throw a crisis on top of a transition? And we'll take COVID as an example. For many of you who managed succession during this period, the added complexity didn't just create new challenges. What it did was it exposed and magnified a lot of the weaknesses that were already there. So you had the business challenges, but then you also had family challenges or say transition challenges that became amplified because of the crisis. So obviously any crisis is going to create emotional strain. There's going to be fear, stress, and all of these things are going to get magnified if there's a transition taking place. And you want to make sure that you'll see this quite often if an owner passes away, that unplanned or rushed transition. If you've been at this process for 2, 3, 4, 5 years, that transition can be much smoother. That's why having preparation and the timeline is certainly going to help. So what COVID did was it did a couple of things. It disrupted operations, which led to disruption in the financial viability of many businesses. So the challenge with when you had a crisis like that was it compounded the transitional risks. Having talked about things beforehand, having had a plan in place beforehand, it wouldn't have eliminated those challenges and those risks, but what it would have done is it would make the transition and did make the transition much smoother. And I think for those of you who went through a transition or helped a family manage it, you could probably see that the pre-planning that was done 2, 3, 4, 5 years ahead of time definitely made a difference. So I think that's all I really have to say on that slide, Krista. Is there anything you wanna add?
No, I mean, we know crisis is going to happen. Could be a medical crisis, could be a COVID, it could be tariffs, it could there's some crisis. We're in a world where we will never have no crisis. Like that is something we can say will never exist. There will always be situations at some point in time, various times, that there could be a crisis, no matter how big or small. And I think, it just heightens everything. So it's important to ensure that you've planned for it. And so if we were to think of sorry.
No, I was just going to say, because this rolls into what you're going to talk about is what are
Yeah,
some things we can actually do when we do hit a crisis. So we can move to
exactly.
the next slide and I'll let you take over.
And this is more just kind of summarizing everything we've talked about really is how do we have some key strategies in place to navigate crises and actually a transition is a crisis because you're trying to figure something out, right? Like it's something that's going to trigger you. And so as we've already talked through a lot of these things already and making sure that you have a plan in place. What if somebody falls ill? And all of a sudden aren't there. What conversations are you having throughout the tenure of the business and throughout the tenure of the succession planning to ensure you identify who those leaders are, whether it's internal people, external people, maybe it's employees, not family members. It's having those processes in place to understand that the business will go on, right? And be transparent. The worst thing people can do is have isolated conversations talking about things and playing the gossip mill, the rumor mill within the enterprise, because that's not going to lead to anything good. And it's going to really, really, really bring out that fight or flight emotional reaction when the communication isn't transparent and people are having hearsay. You want everybody aligned, everybody on the same page. I have a saying, you're not always going to agree, but you have to accept. And having those conversations at the table and understanding where people come from, you come to acceptance that this is how things are going to be, because not everybody can always get their way. I mean, you think about democracy, lots of people don't get their way, but that's the way it works, and you have to accept it and move on and deal with what's going to come. And so that's part of this communication. When you have transparent communication, it allows for greater acceptance to situations. And then timelines and clarity. I've said it already. This is not a quick game. This can be years. And sometimes you don't have years. And unfortunately, that means the planning hasn't happened. And so you're quickly trying to implement a plan without being able to go deep. And that's really where some of the nuances in the planning and the strategies for navigating is start as early as you can. Not waiting, okay, I'm ready to retire. Let's start the process. That's almost too late, right? Because you're now trying to hurry up, and you won't do a service to it. Some other things is make sure you're balancing the family and the business. We talked about at the very beginning, we have family, business, and ownership. If you're not making sure to segregate those and make time for those separately, it is a disservice, and it's going to be hard for decisions to be made. And you want to try as best as possible to preserve harmony and have the governance around when are conversations to be had. What kind of conversations can you have with external persons? Right? It even goes into, what am I allowed to tell my spouse? How deep are spouses involved? There's a lot of nuances to this, and to how the family and the business dynamics place, and the rules and the governance you want to place, so that you ensure that you're maintaining that harmony. And finally, bring in external advisors. That emotional stability is very difficult, and it's not bring them in, create a plan, and try and implement yourself. Because you think about any type of habit, how long it takes. I think it's 3 months to form a habit. If you bring someone in for 2 days, think about any session you've held, any business. I bring someone in for 2 days, we're going to go rah rah, we're going to talk about this, and then we're going to go away, and we're never going to talk about it again. We will immediately fall back into our inherent habits. Whereas this is a process where it requires constant and consistent attention and communication in order to break habits that have pre-existed for probably decades. It's going to take time. And so those are some of the things you really want to make sure that you put in place to ensure some of the strategies in navigating crisis in a transition. And so we'll move to our next polling question. What is the greatest barrier to smooth transitions in your enterprise? I think, yeah, I mean, with all of the families that I've worked with, or the individuals that are part of enterprises and coaching them, it there there are so many dynamics that come into it that really need a lot of mediation and a conflict resolution. Because you can't really have conversations without that. And I don't do therapy. I always recommend a therapist separately, because I'm a coach, a business coach and executive coach. And I think it's a very interesting dynamic. And it's also another thing for the advisors is we can't wear every hat. So
Yeah.
for instance, if I'm going to be a coach with a family enterprise, I will not also be their accountant, because now I have a conflict of interest in what am I trying to serve, right? So it's also important for us to understand our roles and
Mhm.
support them. All right, so all of the above is correct, 84%. Yes, a lack of a clear plan is very important, because without that, you're going to get resistance and you're going to get all
Mhm.
that. But definitely, all of these can create a barrier to a smooth transition.
Yeah, what's important there is you want to identify which one is the most important at the right time. All of them
That's
will
right.
all of them will creep up for sure, but
They'll
having
all
that
surface. Yeah,
objectivity will help. Yeah.
absolutely. Absolutely.
So we'll move on to the last content slide, and I'm just going to speak very briefly about this. And I'm using the term sustainability here, not in the environmental sense, but how do we make sure that the future of the business is sustainable? So whether you're a family business or a pubco, sustainability has the same playbook. And what I want to emphasize on this slide really is start small. Like just do something. Have an uncomfortable conversation, initiate an uncomfortable conversation, or get a trusted advisor to bring 2 or 3 people in the room to have an uncomfortable conversation. Start scheduling regular family meetings. Have a bit of an agenda. That might be a bit awkward at first. I hear from a lot of business owners, we don't like to talk about that stuff. Well, if you just start, you'll find you'll develop your own process around it. Then you can start documenting outcomes. Okay, what are people concerned about? What are our pain points? Who can we find that might be able to help us through this? And then start keeping minutes and holding people accountable. So just that short transition will allow you to start. It's free, it's just your time, and it allows you to at least start building a process. Then you can start graduating into things like drafting a family charter, enlisting the services of an FEA or some other professional advisor. So I think I'll leave it at that just in the interest of time. Let's go to the final slide. And so I think what we'd like, you'll get a survey in an email. We always are looking for things to improve upon, but equally important, what we'd like to know is what topics would you like to hear more about? Could be one specific thing from this webinar, it could be something unrelated, and feel free to reach out to any questions. On that note, I'm going to turn it back to Krista for some closing remarks. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, and again, Shondell, happy birthday. I enjoyed celebrating your birthday with you, and thanks everybody
Thank
for
you.
attending. I don't see many questions, so I think if anybody has any questions that you want to follow up with on, please reach out to us. We're more than happy to talk. And thank you again for attending our webinar, and hopefully you found it useful. Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks all.